Hello, and welcome to this evening's journey through time. Tonight, we'll unfold another page of history and listen closely to the voices it left behind. Maybe you're lying in bed, phone screen dimmed, or maybe you've simply chosen to let the past keep you company for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world and what time it is for you. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honoured if you subscribed. So, picture this. A young woman with dark eyes that could captivate a king, intelligence sharp enough to challenge the greatest minds of her time, and ambition so fierce it would literally reshape an entire nation's religious foundation. But here's the twist that will shock you. This same woman, who wielded more influence over Henry VIII than any other person alive, would meet her end on a scaffold, accused of crimes that historians still debate today. I'm talking about Anne Boleyn, and her story isn't just about love and betrayal. It's about how one woman's refusal to be a mistress sparked a religious revolution, destroyed a 1,000-year relationship between England and Rome, and ultimately cost her everything, including her life. Now, before we dive into this incredible tale of power, passion, and political intrigue, let me tell you why Anne Boleyn's story matters more than you might think. Most people know she was Henry VIII's second wife, and that she was executed. But what they don't realise is that without Anne Boleyn, there would be no Church of England, no Elizabeth I, and English history would look completely different. This woman literally changed the course of Western civilization, and then paid the ultimate price for it. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through the most dramatic rise and fall in royal history. We'll explore how a relatively minor nobleman's daughter managed to ensnare the most powerful monarch in Europe, how she survived court intrigue that would have destroyed lesser women, and how she ultimately became the victim of the very forces she helped unleash. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. I've spent countless hours studying primary sources, court documents, and contemporary accounts to bring you details that most people have never heard. We're talking about secret love letters, midnight meetings, political conspiracies, and betrayals so shocking they'll make your jaw drop. Let's start at the beginning. Because Anne Boleyn's story doesn't begin in the glittering halls of Hampton Court or the Tower of London. It begins in a world most of us can barely imagine, where women had virtually no power, where kings could literally reshape reality to suit their desires, and where one wrong move could mean death. The year was 1507, and Anne Boleyn was born into a family that understood ambition better than most. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, wasn't just any courtier. He was a man who had clawed his way up from minor gentry to become one of Henry VIII's most trusted advisors. Thomas knew that in Tudor England, your daughters were your greatest assets, and he was determined to use his girls to climb even higher. But here's where Anne's story gets interesting. Unlike most noble daughters of her time, who were essentially treated as decorative objects waiting to be married off, Anne received an education that would make most men jealous. She was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, where she learned French, developed sophisticated manners, and most importantly, discovered how to use her intelligence as a weapon. Think about this for a moment. While other English girls her age were learning needlework and how to curtsy properly, Anne Boleyn was studying alongside some of the brightest minds in Europe. She was learning languages, politics, and the subtle art of court manipulation. Without realizing it, she was preparing for a role that didn't even exist yet. From the Netherlands, Anne moved to the French court, which was like attending the most exclusive finishing school in the world. The French court wasn't just about luxury and fashion, though it had plenty of both. It was a place where wit mattered more than beauty, where women could actually influence politics, and where the art of conversation was elevated to a form of warfare. Anne thrived in this environment like a flower finally finding sunlight. She learned to dance with grace that made men stop and stare, to speak with intelligence that impressed even the most cynical courtiers. and to dress in a way that was both elegant and slightly dangerous. But most importantly, she learned something that would change her life forever. She learned that she didn't have to settle for being just another nobleman's wife. When Anne returned to England in 1521, she was no longer the awkward girl who had left years earlier. She was a sophisticated young woman who carried herself with a confidence that was almost magnetic. She had dark hair that she wore longer than was fashionable, eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a way of moving that suggested she knew exactly how much power she possessed. The English court had never seen anything quite like her. Most English noblewomen were pale, quiet, and deferential. Anne was dark, vivacious, and had opinions about everything. She could discuss theology with bishops, politics with ambassadors, and literature with poets. She was, in short, exactly the kind of woman who would catch the attention of a king who was growing bored with his predictable life. But here's the thing about Anne Boleyn that most people don't understand. She wasn't trying to catch the king's attention at first. When she arrived at court, she was actually more interested in a young nobleman named Henry Percy. Percy was everything a romantic young woman could want. He was handsome, wealthy, and completely infatuated with her. They began what appeared to be a serious courtship, and for a brief moment, it seemed like Anne might have the conventional happy ending that society expected. That's when fate, in the form of King Henry VIII, decided to intervene in the most dramatic way possible. Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over a decade, and their marriage had become a political and personal disaster. Catherine, who had been his brother's widow, had failed to give him the male heir he desperately needed. She had suffered through multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, and by 1526, it was clear that she would never produce the son who would secure the Tudor dynasty. Now, Henry wasn't just frustrated about the succession. He was beginning to believe that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God. According to biblical law, a man wasn't supposed to marry his brother's widow, and Henry had convinced himself that his lack of male heirs was divine punishment for this transgression. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Henry had been having affairs throughout his marriage, which was completely normal for kings of that era. What wasn't normal was what happened when he laid eyes on Anne Boleyn. Most of Henry's previous mistresses had been willing participants in brief, discreet relationships that everyone understood were temporary. They received gifts, maybe a title for their families, and then they quietly disappeared when the king grew bored. It was a system that had worked perfectly for years. Anne Boleyn shattered that system completely. When Henry began pursuing her sometime in 1526, Anne did something that shocked everyone, including the king himself. She said no. Not just no to becoming his mistress, but no in a way that made it clear she found the very suggestion insulting. You have to understand how revolutionary this was. Nobody said no to Henry VIII. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when most men were 5.5 feet. He was athletic, intelligent, and possessed absolute power over the lives of everyone around him. When Henry wanted something, he got it, and what he wanted was Anne Boleyn. But Anne had learned something during her years in France that English women hadn't figured out yet. She had learned that the moment you give a man everything he wants, he stops wanting it. So instead of falling into Henry's bed like every other woman at court would have done, Anne began the most sophisticated game of cat and mouse in royal history. She would be charming and flirtatious one day, then distant and almost cold the next. She would accept his gifts, but make it clear that they didn't obligate her to anything. She would engage him in theological debates that challenged his thinking, then disappear from court for weeks at a time, leaving him wondering where she had gone and when she would return. Henry had never encountered anything like this, and it drove him absolutely mad with desire. Here was a woman who treated him not like a king to be feared and obeyed, but like a man who had to prove himself worthy of her attention. For someone who had never been denied anything in his entire life, this was intoxicating beyond measure. The love letters Henry wrote to Anne during this period revealed just how completely she had captured his imagination. these weren't the casual notes of a king to his mistress. These were the desperate pleadings of a man who had lost all sense of proportion. He called her his darling, his sweetheart, his entirely beloved. He promised her that if she would just give him a chance, he would forsake all others for her alone. But Anne's response was always the same. She would not be his mistress. If he wanted her, he would have to marry her. And that meant he would have to find a way to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Think about what Anne was asking for here. She was essentially demanding that the King of England overturn 20 years of marriage, defy the Pope, risk war with the Holy Roman Empire, and potentially tear his kingdom apart, all for the chance to marry her. Any rational person would have laughed at such an impossible demand. Henry didn't laugh. He began moving heaven and earth to make it happen. What followed was one of the most complex legal and political battles in European history. Henry assembled teams of theologians, lawyers, and diplomats to find a way to annul his marriage to Catherine. He sent ambassadors to Rome to argue his case before the Pope. He consulted universities across Europe, seeking scholarly support for his position. The case hinged on a technical point of canon law that would bore most people to tears, but it was fascinating in its complexity. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid because she had previously been married to his deceased brother Arthur. Catherine insisted that her first marriage had never been consummated, which would have made her free to marry Henry. The Pope found himself caught between Henry's demands and the political pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. For Anne, these years of waiting must have been simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. She had managed to capture the heart of the most powerful man in England, but she was also making enemies faster than she could count them. Catherine of Aragon's supporters saw her as a homewrecker who was destroying a legitimate marriage. Conservative nobles viewed her as an upstart whose family had risen too far above their proper station. Even some of Henry's closest advisors worried that his obsession with Anne was damaging England's relationships with other European powers. But Anne had allies too, and they were powerful ones. Her father Thomas had been promoted to Earl of Wiltshire, giving him even more influence at court. Her brother George had become one of Henry's closest companions. Most importantly, she had begun developing relationships with reformist theologians who supported Henry's break with Rome, not just for personal reasons, but because they genuinely believed the English Church needed to be independent of papal authority. This is where Anne's story becomes larger than just a tale of romance and ambition. Whether she fully understood it or not, Anne Boleyn was becoming the focal point of a religious revolution that would reshape not just England, but the entire Protestant world. The religious implications of what was happening were staggering, and they were about to get even more dramatic. By 1528, it was becoming clear that the Pope wasn't going to grant Henry his annulment. The political pressures were too intense, the theological arguments too complex, and frankly, the Catholic Church had too much to lose by setting a precedent that kings could simply dissolve marriages whenever they felt like it. But here's where Anne Boleyn revealed the full extent of her intelligence and ambition. While other women might have given up or accepted a lesser position, Anne saw an opportunity that was breathtaking in its scope. If the Pope wouldn't give Henry what he wanted, then maybe England didn't need the Pope at all. This wasn't just Anne's idea, of course. There were reformist theologians across Europe who had been questioning papal authority for decades. Martin Luther had already sparked the Protestant Reformation in Germany. But Anne became the catalyst that brought these ideas directly into the heart of the English monarchy. She began surrounding herself with men like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, brilliant political minds who saw in Henry's marital problems the chance to fundamentally restructure English society. These weren't just religious reformers, they were revolutionaries who understood that breaking with Rome would give the English crown unprecedented power and wealth. Think about what this meant in practical terms. For over 1,000 years, English kings had acknowledged that there was a higher authority than themselves. the Pope in Rome could excommunicate them, place their entire kingdom under interdict, and rally other Catholic nations against them. It was a system that had kept royal power in check for centuries. Anne Boleyn was essentially encouraging Henry to declare himself the supreme religious authority in England. It was a move so bold, so dangerous, that it would either make them the most powerful couple in English history or destroy them completely. The psychological pressure on Anne during this period must have been unimaginable. She was now in her late 20s, which in Tudor terms meant she was approaching the end of her childbearing years. Every month that passed without a resolution to Henry's marriage problem was a month closer to the possibility that he might lose interest and move on to someone younger. Meanwhile, the attacks on her were becoming increasingly vicious. Catherine of Aragon's supporters didn't just dislike Anne, they despised her with a passion that bordered on hysteria. They called her a whore, a witch, and worse. They spread rumours that she had 6 fingers on one hand, that she had a goiter on her neck, that she had seduced the king through dark magic. These weren't just casual insults. In an age when people genuinely believed in witchcraft, accusations like these could be deadly. Anne was walking a tightrope where one misstep could lead not just to social ruin, but to being burned at the stake. Yet she persevered, and her relationship with Henry only seemed to grow stronger under pressure. The king wasn't just infatuated with her anymore, he was completely devoted to her. He had restructured his entire court around her presence, elevating her family to unprecedented heights, and making it clear that anyone who opposed Anne was opposing him. By 1532, Henry had reached a decision that would echo through history. He couldn't wait for papal approval any longer. He would marry Anne Boleyn with or without the Pope's blessing. And if that meant breaking with Rome entirely, so be it. The secret wedding took place sometime in late 1532 or early 1533. The exact date is still debated by historians, but what we know for certain is that it happened in complete secrecy, probably in the early morning hours in a small chapel with only a handful of witnesses present. Can you imagine that moment? Anne Boleyn, the woman who had spent 6 years refusing to become the king's mistress, finally becoming his wife in a ceremony so secret that even today we're not entirely sure when or where it happened. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for, but it was also the beginning of the most dangerous period of her life. Because here's the thing about getting everything you've ever wanted. Suddenly, you have everything to lose. The public announcement of the marriage sent shockwaves across Europe. The Pope was furious and immediately began preparing to excommunicate Henry. The Holy Roman Emperor started making threats about potential military action. Even Henry's own subjects were divided, with many remaining loyal to Catherine of Aragon and viewing Anne as a usurper. But Anne had achieved something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. She was now Queen of England, and she was pregnant with what everyone hoped would be the male heir Henry so desperately needed. The coronation ceremony on June 1st, 1533, was one of the most spectacular events in English history. Henry spared no expense in making sure the world understood that Anne Boleyn was his legitimate queen. The procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey took hours, with Anne carried in a litter covered in cloth of gold, wearing robes that cost more than most nobles earned in a lifetime. Yet even in her moment of triumph, there were ominous signs. The crowds that lined the streets were notably subdued. Many people refused to remove their caps as she passed, a sign of disrespect that would have been unthinkable for a popular queen. Some courtiers noticed that the initials H and A, which decorated the route, could easily be rearranged to spell HA, as if the whole thing were some cosmic joke. Anne herself seemed to sense that her victory might be temporary. Contemporary accounts describe her as nervous during the ceremony, constantly touching her stomach where her unborn child was growing. Everything depended on that child being male. If she could give Henry the son he needed, her position would be secure. If she couldn't, well, History had shown what happened to queens who failed to produce male heirs. The pressure was enormous, and it was about to get worse. Because while Anne was adjusting to life as queen, Henry was discovering that breaking with Rome had consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. The Act of Supremacy, which made him the head of the Church of England, also made him responsible for the spiritual welfare of millions of souls. It was a burden that weighed heavily on a man who, despite his many faults, took his religious duties seriously. More practically, the break with Rome had made England isolated on the European stage. Traditional allies were now potential enemies, trade relationships were strained, and there was a constant threat of invasion from Catholic powers who viewed Henry as a heretical usurper. Anne found herself at the centre of all these pressures. She wasn't just Henry's wife anymore, she was a symbol of England's religious revolution. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, every outfit she wore was scrutinised for political meaning. She had to be the perfect Protestant queen, the loving wife, the wise counsellor, and the future mother of England's heir, all while navigating a court filled with people who would happily see her destroyed. Then, on September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child. The baby was healthy, beautiful, and perfectly formed. There was just one problem. It was a girl. The disappointment in the royal household was palpable. Henry put on a brave face, but everyone knew he was devastated. All those years of struggle, all that political upheaval, all those burned bridges with the Catholic world, and the result was another daughter when he already had one from his first marriage. They named the baby Elizabeth after Henry's mother and tried to convince themselves that surely a son would follow soon. After all, Anne was still young, still healthy, still capable of having more children. This was just the first child, not the last. But something had changed in Henry's attitude toward Anne. The desperate passion that had driven him to reshape his entire kingdom was beginning to cool. The political situation was becoming more complex by the day, and Anne was no longer the solution to all his problems. She was starting to become a problem herself. Anne sensed this shift immediately. She had spent too many years studying the subtle dynamics of court politics to miss the signs. Henry was still affectionate, still protective, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. The birth of Elizabeth should have been a celebration, but instead it felt like the beginning of something ominous. The next few months were a delicate balancing act for Anne. She had to be the devoted wife and mother while also maintaining her political influence. She had to support Henry's religious reforms while managing the growing opposition to their marriage. Most importantly, she had to get pregnant again as quickly as possible, because everyone understood that her long-term survival depended on producing a male heir. The court was watching her every move, looking for signs of weakness or failure. Her enemies were circling like vultures, waiting for any opportunity to bring her down. Her supporters were nervous, understanding that their own fortunes were tied to hers. Meanwhile, Henry was dealing with the massive practical consequences of his decision to break with Rome. The dissolution of the monasteries was beginning, a process that would transfer enormous wealth to the crown, but also create social upheaval across England. Thomas More, his former closest advisor, had been executed for refusing to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the church. The political landscape was shifting daily, and Anne found herself having to navigate increasingly treacherous waters. By 1534, it was becoming clear that Anne's position as queen was more precarious than anyone had imagined. She had won the battle to become Henry's wife, but she was losing the war to remain his beloved partner. The man who had once written her passionate love letters was now viewing her more as a political asset than as the love of his life. The irony was heartbreaking. Anne had achieved everything she had dreamed of, but success was turning into a nightmare. She was Queen of England, but she was also increasingly isolated, increasingly vulnerable, and increasingly aware that in Henry's world, today's beloved could very easily become tomorrow's enemy. The pregnancy that everyone hoped would secure Anne's future came in 1535, but it ended in miscarriage. The loss devastated both Henry and Anne, but it also marked a turning point that neither of them fully understood at the time. This wasn't just the loss of a potential heir, it was the beginning of the end of their relationship. Henry's reaction to the miscarriage revealed just how much his feelings toward Anne had changed. Instead of comforting his grieving wife, he began openly questioning whether God was punishing him again. The same religious doubts that had driven him to divorce Catherine were now being turned against Anne. Maybe, he wondered, this marriage was also cursed. Anne could sense the shift, and it terrified her. She had seen what happened to queens who failed to produce sons. She had watched Catherine of Aragon go from beloved wife to discarded inconvenience. Now she was starting to see that same cold calculation in Henry's eyes when he looked at her. The court atmosphere became increasingly tense. Anne's enemies, who had been forced into silence during her rise to power, were beginning to whisper again. They spoke quietly at first, testing the waters, but as Henry's enthusiasm for his second wife continued to cool, their voices grew bolder. Jane Seymour appeared at court during this period like a pale ghost from Anne's past. Jane was everything Anne was not. Quiet where Anne was outspoken, submissive where Anne was assertive, conventionally pious where Anne was religiously progressive. She was also young, fresh and untainted by the political controversies that now surrounded the Queen. Henry's interest in Jane began exactly the way his pursuit of Anne had started, with meaningful glances across crowded rooms and small gestures of favour. But there was a crucial difference this time. Jane had learned from watching Anne's example. She understood that the key to capturing the king's lasting interest was to remain just out of reach. Anne watched this developing situation with growing horror. She was witnessing her own story being replayed, but this time she was cast in Catherine of Aragon's role as the unwanted wife. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Her response was to fight back in the only way she knew how. Anne had never been passive or accepting, and she wasn't about to start now. She became more vocal in her opinions, more demanding of Henry's attention, more insistent on her rights as queen. Unfortunately, this approach backfired spectacularly. What had once seemed charming and spirited in a woman, Henry was trying to win now, appeared shrewish and difficult in a wife he was trying to manage. The very qualities that had made Anne irresistible during their courtship were now making her insufferable as his queen. The political situation was also becoming more complicated. Anne had always been associated with religious reform, but by 1536, the pace of change was making even Henry uncomfortable. The dissolution of the monasteries was creating social unrest. The execution of Thomas More had shocked Europe. Traditional Catholic nobles were growing increasingly rebellious. Henry was beginning to wonder if his religious revolution had gone too far, and Anne was the symbol of that revolution. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of the price he had paid for their marriage. Every foreign ambassador who refused to recognize her as legitimate queen was a reminder of England's isolation. Every Catholic subject who mourned the old ways was an implicit criticism of the choices Henry had made for love. The breaking point came in January 1536, when Anne suffered another miscarriage. This time, the lost child had been male, and the tragedy sent Henry into a rage that was terrifying to witness. He accused Anne of disappointing him yet again, of failing in her most basic duty as a wife, of being unable to give him what any peasant woman could provide. Anne's response was equally furious. She had endured years of pressure, criticism, and isolation. She had been blamed for everything from bad weather to diplomatic failures. Now she was being blamed for a biological tragedy that was beyond anyone's control. Her famous temper, which she had learned to control during their courtship, finally exploded. The argument that followed was witnessed by several courtiers and their accounts paint a picture of a marriage that had deteriorated beyond repair. Henry accused Anne of trapping him into marriage through witchcraft. Anne accused Henry of being a faithless husband who had never truly loved her. Both said things that could never be taken back. But here's what made this fight different from their previous disagreements. This time, Henry didn't try to make up with Anne afterward. Instead, he withdrew from her completely. And when a king withdraws his favour from a queen, it sends a signal throughout the court that her protection is gone. Thomas Cromwell, who had once been Anne's ally in promoting religious reform, began to see her as a liability. If Henry wanted to be rid of his second wife, Cromwell was prepared to find a way to make it happen. The man who had helped engineer Catherine of Aragon's downfall was now turning his considerable talents toward destroying Anne Boleyn. The charges that Cromwell eventually brought against Anne were so shocking that even her enemies were amazed by their audacity. Adultery, treason, and incest with her own brother George. These weren't just accusations of infidelity, they were claims that Anne had betrayed her marriage, her country, and the most basic moral laws of human society. Modern historians have examined these charges extensively, and the consensus is clear. They were almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was thin, the witnesses were unreliable, and the timeline of the alleged offences made little logical sense. But in the political climate of 1536, logic was less important than convenience. Henry wanted to be rid of Anne, and Cromwell was providing him with a legally acceptable way to do it. The specific truth of the charges mattered less than their political utility. Anne Boleyn had become inconvenient, and inconvenient queens rarely survived in Tudor England. The speed with which Anne's world collapsed was breathtaking. In early April 1536, she was still queen, still powerful, still protected by her royal status. By the beginning of May, she was a prisoner in the Tower of London, facing charges that could cost her not just her crown, but her life. The men accused alongside her were arrested first. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, was tortured until he confessed to having an affair with the Queen. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston, all gentlemen of the King's Privy Chamber, were charged with the same crime. Most shocking of all, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, was accused of having an incestuous relationship with her. When Anne was finally arrested on May 2nd, 1536, she seemed genuinely shocked by what was happening. According to witnesses, she alternated between desperate denials and hysterical laughter. The woman who had once controlled the fate of kingdoms couldn't believe that her own fate had been decided so quickly and so brutally. The Tower of London, where Anne was imprisoned, held special significance for her. It was the same place where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. Then, she had been preparing for the greatest triumph of her life. Now, she was awaiting what would almost certainly be its end. Her behaviour during her imprisonment revealed both her intelligence and her desperation. Anne knew that her only hope lay in convincing Henry that the charges against her were false. She wrote him letter after letter, protesting her innocence and begging for mercy. She reminded him of their love, their daughter Elizabeth, the sacrifices they had both made for their marriage. Henry never replied to any of these letters. He had already moved on, both emotionally and practically. Even before Anne's trial had begun, he was making plans to marry Jane Seymour. The annulment of his marriage to Anne was already being prepared, which would have the convenient effect of making Elizabeth illegitimate and removing her from the line of succession. The trials of Anne's alleged lovers began on May 12th. The evidence against them was circumstantial at best, relying heavily on Mark Smeaton's tortured confession and vague testimonies about suspicious conversations and meaningful glances. In a fair legal system, these charges would have been laughed out of court. But this wasn't a fair legal system. This was Tudor justice, where the verdict was often decided before the trial began. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston all maintained their innocence to the end, but they were condemned nonetheless. Mark Smeaton, perhaps hoping that his confession would save him, was also sentenced to death. George Boleyn's trial was particularly tragic. The evidence against him was even weaker than the charges against the other men, consisting mainly of gossip about him spending time in his sister's chambers. The incest charge was so outrageous that even some of Anne's enemies found it difficult to believe. But George had made the mistake of being too close to his sister, too involved in her political activities, and too influential in his own right. In the paranoid atmosphere surrounding Anne's downfall, these qualities made him dangerous. His execution was as much about eliminating a potential threat as it was about punishing alleged crimes. Anne's own trial took place on May 15th, 1536, in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. She was brought before a jury of 26 peers, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who was serving as Lord High Steward. The symbolism was brutal. Anne was being judged by the very nobility she had risen above, including members of her own family. The charges read against her painted a picture of a woman so depraved, so treacherous, that she barely seemed human. She was accused of seducing multiple men, of plotting the king's death, of mocking Henry's physical appearance, of promising to marry Henry Norris after the king's death. Each accusation was designed not just to justify her execution, but to destroy her reputation for all time. Anne's response to these charges revealed the full extent of her courage and intelligence. She didn't simply deny the accusations, she systematically dismantled them. She pointed out the logical inconsistencies in the timeline, questioned the credibility of the witnesses, and challenged the very legal basis for the charges. Her performance was so impressive that even some of her judges seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings. Several observers noted that she defended herself with more skill than many professional lawyers could have managed. But skill and logic were irrelevant when the outcome had already been decided. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The sentence was death, either by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Anne received the news with a composure that amazed everyone present. She had always known that this was the likely outcome, but hearing it spoken aloud still came as a shock. Her final speech to the court was a masterpiece of dignity under impossible circumstances. She maintained her innocence while expressing forgiveness for those who had condemned her. She praised Henry as a good and gracious prince, despite everything he had done to her. Most importantly, she commended her soul to God and asked that people pray for her. The days between her sentencing and execution were filled with a strange mixture of resignation and hope. Anne still believed, or at least wanted to believe, that Henry might show mercy at the last moment. She wrote to him again, this time focusing not on her own fate, but on their daughter Elizabeth's future. She begged him not to let their personal conflicts affect their child's prospects. Meanwhile, Henry was already celebrating his freedom. He had become engaged to Jane Seymour the day after Anne's trial, and was making plans for their wedding. The speed of his emotional transition was stunning even by his own standards. The woman he had once claimed to love more than life itself was now nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. The method of Anne's execution became a subject of debate in Henry's council. Burning was the traditional punishment for treason by a woman, but even Henry seemed to recognize that this would be excessive. Instead, he made the unusual decision to import a professional swordsman from France, supposedly as a mercy to Anne. This gesture has been interpreted by historians as either a final act of consideration for his former wife, or as a practical decision to ensure a clean execution that wouldn't horrify European observers. Given Henry's character, the practical explanation seems more likely. Anne spent her final days in prayer and preparation. She received communion according to the rites of the Church of England, the religious institution that had been created largely to facilitate her marriage to Henry. The irony was profound. She was dying as a result of the same religious revolution she had helped to create. Her last night was spent in wakeful prayer and conversation with the women who had been assigned to attend her. These women later reported that Anne seemed almost relieved that her ordeal was finally coming to an end. The constant pressure, the political maneuvering, the desperate attempts to maintain Henry's love had exhausted her completely. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to a scaffold that had been specially constructed for her execution. She was dressed in a grey damask gown with a white cap, and she carried herself with the same grace that had first captured Henry's attention years earlier. The crowd that gathered to watch her die was surprisingly small. Henry had deliberately limited the number of witnesses, perhaps out of some lingering sense of shame about what he was doing. Those who were present described Anne as appearing calm and composed, though several noted that her hands shook slightly as she prepared to address the crowd. Her final speech was brief but powerful. She maintained her innocence without directly contradicting the legal judgment against her. She forgave her enemies and asked for prayers. Most significantly, she praised Henry as a good and gentle prince, even though he was about to have her killed. This final act of loyalty to Henry has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as genuine forgiveness from a woman who still loved the man who had destroyed her. Others view it as a practical decision designed to protect Elizabeth's future by avoiding any suggestion that the king was unjust or cruel. The execution itself was swift and professional. The French swordsman Henry had imported completed his work with a single stroke, and Anne Boleyn's remarkable life came to an end before most of the witnesses fully realized what had happened. Her body was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. There was no elaborate funeral, no mourning period, no official recognition of her years as queen. Henry wanted her erased from history as quickly and completely as possible, but history had other plans for Anne Boleyn. Her daughter Elizabeth would grow up to become one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling for 45 years and transforming England into a major European power. The religious changes that Anne had supported would become permanent features of English society. The political precedents established during her rise and fall would influence royal marriages for centuries to come. The woman who had loved and lost her head had, in death, achieved a kind of immortality that Henry could never have anticipated. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, the fickleness of royal favour, and the price of ambition. But it also became an inspiration for anyone who had ever dared to challenge the established order, to demand more than society was willing to give, or to risk everything for love. Anne Boleyn's legacy is complex and contradictory, much like the woman herself. She was simultaneously a victim and a revolutionary, a romantic figure and a hard-headed politician, a devoted mother and a ruthless social climber. She changed the course of English history through her refusal to accept the limitations that society placed on women, but she also paid the ultimate price for that refusal. Her story resonates across the centuries because it captures something fundamental about the human condition. The tension between our dreams and our reality, between what we want and what we can safely have, between the desire to be extraordinary and the dangers that come with standing out from the crowd. In the end, Anne Boleyn got everything she thought she wanted, only to discover that success could be more dangerous than failure, that being queen could be more precarious than being a commoner, and that the love of a king could be more deadly than his hatred. But here's where Anne Boleyn's story takes on an almost supernatural quality that has fascinated people for nearly 500 years. Within hours of her execution, strange things began happening at court that would cement her reputation as one of history's most unforgettable figures. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's death. 11 days. Think about that for a moment. The woman who had turned his world upside down, who had caused him to break with Rome and reshape English Christianity, who had given birth to his daughter, was replaced faster than most people changed their sheets. But Jane Seymour's triumph was shorter than anyone could have imagined. She gave Henry the son he had always wanted. the future Edward VI, but she died just 12 days after childbirth. Some courtiers whispered that it was Anne's revenge from beyond the grave. Others said it was divine justice for taking a dead woman's place so quickly. The real twist in this story, though, is what happened to Elizabeth. Remember, Henry had declared her illegitimate when he annulled his marriage to Anne. She went from being a princess to being legally nobody overnight. At just 2 years old, Elizabeth Tudor had lost not only her mother, but her entire identity. Henry seemed determined to erase any trace of Anne from his daughter's life. Elizabeth was sent away from court, given a modest household, and largely forgotten by the man who had once been willing to tear Europe apart for her mother's love. The little girl, who should have been one of the most important people in England, was instead treated like an inconvenient reminder of her father's past mistakes. But here's what Henry didn't understand about the Boleyn women. They were survivors. Elizabeth inherited not just her mother's dark eyes and sharp intelligence, but also her ability to navigate impossible political situations. Even as a child, she seemed to understand that her survival depended on staying out of her father's way, while never completely disappearing from his consciousness. The irony of Elizabeth's early years is almost too perfect. Anne had fought so hard to become queen, to secure her position, to guarantee her future. She had failed spectacularly, losing everything, including her life. But her daughter, the child whose birth had disappointed Henry so deeply, would eventually become everything Anne had dreamed of being and more. While Elizabeth was learning to survive in the shadows, the English court was discovering that removing Anne Boleyn from the picture hadn't solved any of Henry's fundamental problems. He still needed multiple male heirs to secure the succession. He was still isolated from Catholic Europe. The religious reforms he had implemented were still causing social upheaval throughout England. Jane Seymour's death left Henry devastated in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. He had married her primarily because she was the opposite of Anne, but her gentle nature and tragic death made him realize what he had lost when he destroyed his second wife. For the first time, Henry began to understand that his treatment of Anne might have been excessive. This realization came too late for Anne, obviously, but it had profound implications for how Henry would treat his remaining children. He began to soften toward both Mary, his daughter with Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth. Not enough to restore them to the succession immediately, but enough to bring them back to court occasionally and ensure they received proper educations. Elizabeth's education became one of the most important factors in her eventual success. The tutors Henry provided for her were among the finest scholars in Europe, men who understood that they were shaping not just a royal bastard, but potentially a future ruler of England. They taught her languages, history, philosophy, and most importantly, the art of political survival. But Elizabeth was learning her most important lessons from observation rather than formal instruction. She watched as Henry married and divorced Anne of Cleves within months. She witnessed the execution of Catherine Howard, her father's fifth wife, who made the fatal mistake of having a romantic past that Henry discovered after their marriage. Each of these marital disasters taught Elizabeth something crucial about the nature of power, particularly the precarious position of women in a world dominated by men. She saw how quickly love could turn to hatred, how easily queens could become victims, and how dangerous it was to depend entirely on one man's affection for survival. The young Elizabeth was essentially receiving a masterclass in political strategy from the most ruthless teacher imaginable, her own father's court. She learned to be charming without being threatening, intelligent without being challenging, and ambitious without being obvious about it. These were skills her mother had never quite mastered, and they would prove essential to Elizabeth's eventual success. Meanwhile, the memory of Anne Boleyn was taking on a life of its own throughout England. Henry had tried to erase her from history, but people don't forget dramatic stories easily. Anne's rise and fall had been so spectacular, so shocking, that it became the stuff of legend, even while people who had known her were still alive. The stories that circulated about Anne in the years after her death reveal how her contemporaries struggled to understand what had happened. Some painted her as a seductress who had used dark magic to ensnare the king. Others portrayed her as an innocent victim of Henry's cruelty and Cromwell's political machinations. Still others saw her as a religious reformer who had died for her Protestant beliefs. All of these interpretations contained elements of truth, but none captured the full complexity of who Anne Boleyn actually was. She had been simultaneously calculating and passionate, intelligent and naive, powerful and vulnerable. Her story was too complicated for the simple moral categories that most people preferred. What's fascinating is how different social classes remembered Anne differently. The common people, who had initially resented her for displacing the popular Catherine of Aragon, gradually began to see her as a victim of royal tyranny. The nobility, who had watched her rise from relatively modest origins to the throne, used her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition. Religious reformers, meanwhile, began to claim Anne as a Protestant martyr. They argued that she had been executed not for adultery or treason, but because she had supported the English Reformation and opposed the Catholic Church. This interpretation would become increasingly important as England moved further away from Rome under Elizabeth's eventual reign. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than any of these simple narratives. Anne had indeed supported religious reform, but she had also been a shrewd political operator who understood that backing Henry's break with Rome served her personal interests. She had been victimized by Henry's cruelty, but she had also participated willingly in the destruction of Catherine of Aragon. The complexity of Anne's legacy became even more apparent as Elizabeth began to assert herself as a potential heir to the throne. As Henry's son Edward was sickly and his daughter Mary was a committed Catholic, Elizabeth represented the future of English Protestantism. This meant that Anne Boleyn's reputation was no longer just a historical curiosity, it was a political necessity. Elizabeth handled this challenge with the same intelligence her mother had shown, but with far more caution. She never directly defended Anne's memory, which would have been dangerous. Instead, she simply lived her life in a way that honored her mother's legacy while avoiding her mother's mistakes. When Henry died in 1547, Elizabeth was just 13 years old, but she was already demonstrating the political acumen that would make her legendary. She navigated the dangerous waters of Edward's reign, survived Mary's attempt to restore Catholicism to England, and positioned herself as the natural heir when both of her siblings died without children. The moment Elizabeth became queen in 1558 marked the ultimate vindication of Anne Boleyn's sacrifice. The daughter who had been declared illegitimate, whose mother had been executed as a traitor, was now the most powerful person in England. Everything Anne had dreamed of achieving, Elizabeth would accomplish, and more. But Elizabeth never forgot the lessons of her mother's rise and fall. She never married, partly because she understood that a husband would automatically become more powerful than she was. She never had children, recognizing that pregnancy would make her vulnerable, and that a male heir might eventually challenge her authority. Most importantly, Elizabeth learned to manage Parliament, the nobility, and foreign powers, with a skill that Anne had never quite developed. Where Anne had often been confrontational and demanding, Elizabeth was subtle and manipulative. Where Anne had relied primarily on Henry's love to maintain her position, Elizabeth built a network of supporters and advisors who were invested in her success. The religious settlement that Elizabeth established in England was also, in many ways, a tribute to her mother's memory. The Elizabethan Church was Protestant in theology, but retained enough Catholic traditions to avoid alienating conservatives. It was exactly the kind of compromise that Anne might have supported had she lived to see it implemented. Elizabeth's 45-year reign transformed England from a relatively minor European power into a major force on the world stage. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of English literature and theatre, the expansion of trade and exploration. All of these achievements built on the foundation that had been laid during the tumultuous years of Anne Boleyn's influence. Yet Elizabeth rarely spoke publicly about her mother, and when she did, it was always carefully and diplomatically. She understood that Anne's memory was still controversial, that there were people in England who still viewed her as a usurper and adulteress. Elizabeth couldn't afford to alienate these people by defending her mother too vigorously. Instead, Elizabeth let her actions speak for her. She surrounded herself with advisors who had supported religious reform. She promoted policies that strengthened England's independence from foreign influence. She demonstrated through her rule that a woman could be an effective monarch, something that many people had doubted after observing the fates of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The irony of Elizabeth's success is that it required her to be everything her mother hadn't been able to be. Anne had been passionate and impulsive. Elizabeth was calculating and controlled. Anne had put her trust in one man's love. Elizabeth trusted no one completely. Anne had dreamed of being queen. Elizabeth made herself indispensable. This doesn't mean that Elizabeth was better than her mother, or that Anne was somehow deficient. Rather, it shows how much the political landscape had changed in the 20 years between Anne's execution and Elizabeth's accession. The lessons of Anne's fall had been absorbed not just by Elizabeth, but by the entire English political system. The nobles who served Elizabeth had seen what happened to queens who overreached. The Parliament that worked with her understood the dangers of pushing royal authority too far. The church that she led had learned to balance reform with stability. Anne's death had taught everyone involved in English politics the importance of compromise and moderation. But Elizabeth's success also vindicated Anne's original vision in ways that her mother could never have imagined. Anne had believed that England could be independent of papal authority, and Elizabeth proved her right. Anne had thought that religious reform could strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy, and Elizabeth's reign demonstrated this conclusively. Most importantly, Anne had believed that a woman could rule England effectively, even though she never got the chance to prove it herself. Elizabeth's reign was the ultimate proof of this belief, showing that female monarchs could be just as capable, just as successful, and just as beloved as their male counterparts. The relationship between mother and daughter across time and death became one of the most powerful undercurrents of Elizabeth's reign. Though she rarely mentioned Anne directly, Elizabeth's policies and personality were clearly shaped by her mother's example. She inherited Anne's intelligence, her religious convictions, and her determination to succeed in a world dominated by men. But she also inherited the trauma of her mother's fate. Elizabeth grew up knowing that queens could be discarded, that love could turn to hatred overnight, that political miscalculations could be fatal. This knowledge made her cautious in ways that Anne had never been, but it also made her stronger. The ghost of Anne Boleyn haunted the English court throughout Elizabeth's reign, not as a malevolent spirit, but as a reminder of both the possibilities and the dangers that came with royal power. Courtiers who remembered Anne's rise and fall treated Elizabeth with a mixture of respect and wariness, understanding that she was both more powerful and more vulnerable than she appeared. Foreign ambassadors, particularly those from Catholic countries, struggled to understand how to deal with Elizabeth, partly because of her mother's controversial reputation. They couldn't decide whether to treat her as a legitimate monarch or as the bastard daughter of an executed adulteress. This confusion actually worked to Elizabeth's advantage, as it kept potential enemies off balance. The common people of England, meanwhile, gradually came to see Elizabeth's success as a kind of cosmic justice for the wrongs done to her mother. The same crowds who had once remained silent during Anne's coronation procession cheered wildly for Elizabeth throughout her reign. It was as if the daughter's triumph had somehow redeemed the mother's tragedy. The writers and artists of Elizabeth's court were particularly fascinated by this connection between mother and daughter. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and other great writers of the era created works that explored themes of female power, royal legitimacy, and the relationship between love and politics. While they rarely addressed Anne's story directly, the influence of her legacy can be felt throughout Elizabethan literature. The evolution of Anne Boleyn's reputation during Elizabeth's reign shows how history is constantly being rewritten by the living. What had seemed like a simple story of ambition and punishment during Henry's lifetime became a complex tale of sacrifice and vindication under Elizabeth's rule. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, Anne Boleyn was no longer remembered primarily as the adulteress who had seduced Henry away from his lawful wife. Instead, she was increasingly seen as the mother of England's greatest queen, the woman whose sacrifice had made possible the golden age of English culture and power. This transformation of Anne's reputation wasn't accidental. Elizabeth and her advisors understood the importance of historical narrative in maintaining political legitimacy. They couldn't directly rehabilitate Anne's memory without reopening dangerous religious and political controversies, but they could allow her story to be gradually reinterpreted in more favourable terms. The process was subtle but effective. Court historians began to emphasise Anne's role in supporting religious reform, rather than her personal relationship with Henry. Artists started to focus on her intelligence and education, rather than her supposed sexual improprieties. Writers explored themes of female martyrdom and political persecution that resonated with Anne's story without explicitly referencing it. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, Anne Boleyn had been transformed from a cautionary tale into something approaching a tragic heroine. Her daughter's success had retroactively justified her ambitions, her suffering, and even her death. The final irony of Anne Boleyn's story is that she achieved her ultimate victory not through her own actions, but through her daughter's. Everything she had fought for, everything she had risked, everything she had lost, was vindicated by Elizabeth's reign. The woman who had lost her head for love had, through her child, won a place in history that no execution could erase. When Elizabeth died childless, the Tudor dynasty came to an end, but Anne Boleyn's influence on English history was just beginning. The precedents established during her rise and fall, the religious changes she had supported, and the example of female rule provided by her daughter would continue to shape England for centuries to come. The little girl, who had been declared illegitimate at age 2, had grown up to be one of history's most successful monarchs. The Queen, who had been executed for treason, had become the mother of England's golden age. The woman who had loved and lost her head had, in the end, won immortality through her daughter's triumph. Anne Boleyn's story doesn't end with her execution on that scaffold in 1536. It continues through Elizabeth's reign, through the development of English Protestantism, through the evolution of parliamentary government, and through every subsequent debate about the role of women in positions of power. Her legacy is written not just in history books, but in the very structure of modern Britain. The Church of England exists because Anne refused to become Henry's mistress. The English-speaking world is predominantly Protestant, partly because of the religious changes she supported. The idea that women can rule as effectively as men was proven by her daughter's extraordinary reign. The woman who had been willing to risk everything for love had, unknowingly, risked everything for the future of her country. Her personal tragedy became England's triumph. Her individual sacrifice became a nation's gain, and her desperate gamble for happiness became one of the most important turning points in Western history. Anne Boleyn loved and lost her head, but through that loss, she gave birth to an age of unprecedented English power and influence that would reshape the entire world. The Queen who lived for only a few years changed the course of centuries, and the mother who died when her daughter was just 2 years old continued to influence that daughter's decisions for 45 years of successful rule. That's the beautiful tragedy of Anne Boleyn's story. But here's where it gets even more incredible. Because while Anne was changing the course of history through her daughter, the ripple effects of her life and death were spreading far beyond England's borders in ways that nobody could have predicted. Let me tell you about what was happening in the rest of Europe while Elizabeth was establishing herself as one of history's greatest monarchs. The Catholic Church was facing its biggest crisis since the Protestant Reformation began. England wasn't just another country that had broken away from Rome anymore. Under Elizabeth, it was becoming a major Protestant power that was actively challenging Catholic dominance across the continent. Think about this from the Pope's perspective. Anne Boleyn had been dead for decades, but her influence was still growing stronger every year. The religious changes that had begun with Henry's desire to marry her were now threatening the entire Catholic world order. Spanish treasure fleets were being attacked by English privateers. Catholic missionaries were being expelled from English territories. Protestant ideas were spreading to France, the Netherlands, and even Italy itself. The Spanish King Philip II looked at Elizabeth's England and saw Anne Boleyn's ultimate revenge. This wasn't just about religion anymore. This was about power, wealth, and the future of European civilization. Philip had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, and he had watched helplessly as Mary's attempts to restore Catholicism to England had failed completely. Now, Elizabeth was not only maintaining her father's religious settlement, she was expanding it. English merchants were competing with Spanish traders in the New World. English explorers were challenging Spanish claims to entire continents. The daughter of the woman Philip's church had condemned as an adulteress was becoming his greatest enemy. The story of how Anne Boleyn's legacy played out on the international stage reads like the most dramatic novel ever written. In 1588, Philip finally decided he had had enough. He assembled the largest naval invasion force in history, the Spanish Armada, with the explicit goal of deposing Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule to England. Picture the scene: 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, sailing toward the English coast with the blessing of the Pope and the financial backing of the richest empire in the world. This wasn't just a military campaign. It was a crusade designed to undo everything that had begun with Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry. Elizabeth's response to this threat revealed just how much of her mother's fighting spirit she had inherited. Instead of hiding in her palaces or fleeing to safety, she rode to Tilbury to address her troops personally. Dressed in white with a silver breastplate, she delivered one of the most famous speeches in English history. She told her soldiers that she might have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. Those words, spoken by Anne Boleyn's daughter, as she faced the greatest Catholic invasion force ever assembled, represented the complete triumph of everything Anne had fought for. The defeat of the Spanish Armada wasn't just a military victory, it was a vindication of the entire English Reformation. The storms that scattered Philip's ships were interpreted by Protestant propagandists as divine approval for Elizabeth's rule. God himself, they claimed, was on the side of Anne Boleyn's daughter. But let me tell you about someone whose story shows just how far Anne's influence had spread beyond the world of kings and queens. His name was John Fox, and he was a scholar who had lived through the reigns of Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. Fox had watched the English church transform from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic, and back to Protestant again. During Mary's reign, when Catholic persecution of Protestants was at its worst, Fox had fled to the continent to save his life. He spent years in exile, watching from afar as Mary burned hundreds of English Protestants at the stake. Among those martyrs were people who had supported Anne Boleyn, people who had believed in the religious reform she had championed. When Elizabeth became queen and Fox was able to return to England, he began working on a massive project that would change how English people understood their own history. He called it Acts and Monuments, but everyone knew it as Fox's Book of Martyrs. This enormous work documented every Protestant who had died for their faith during Mary's reign. Here's what's fascinating about Fox's book. He didn't just list names and dates. He told stories. He described the courage of ordinary people who had chosen to die rather than renounce their Protestant beliefs. He He painted vivid pictures of their final moments, their last words, their unwavering faith in the face of horrible deaths. And woven throughout these stories was the implicit understanding that all of these martyrs had died for beliefs that had first taken root in England because of Anne Boleyn. She wasn't mentioned by name very often because her reputation was still controversial, but her influence was everywhere in Fox's narrative. The book became one of the most popular works in Elizabethan England. Families would read it aloud in their homes. Churches would chain copies to their pulpits so that anyone could access them. Children would grow up hearing these stories of Protestant martyrdom and understanding that their religious freedom had been bought with blood. What Fox had done, without quite realizing it, was create a national mythology that placed Anne Boleyn's religious legacy at the center of English identity. Every Protestant who read about Mary's martyrs was reminded that English Christianity was different from Roman Christianity, that it was worth dying for, and that it had been established by monarchs who had been willing to break with 1,000 years of tradition. This cultural transformation was happening at the same time that England was becoming a major power on the world stage. Elizabeth's court was attracting artists, writers, scientists, and philosophers from across Europe. The English language itself was evolving rapidly, absorbing influences from Latin, French, Italian, and dozens of other tongues. The man who benefited most from this cultural flowering was someone whose name has become synonymous with English literature: William Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare never wrote a play directly about Anne Boleyn, which isn't surprising given how politically sensitive her story remained. But the themes that dominated his work, the questions he explored, the psychological insights he offered, all of them were shaped by the world that Anne had helped create. Think about Shakespeare's great history plays, the works that dramatized the rise and fall of English kings. These plays were written for audiences who had lived through the reigns of Henry, Mary, and Elizabeth. They were people who understood intimately how quickly royal favor could change, how dangerous it was to be close to power, how personal relationships could reshape entire kingdoms. When Shakespeare wrote about the fall of Cardinal Wolsey in Henry VIII, his audience knew they were watching a story that paralleled Anne Boleyn's own rise and fall. When he explored themes of political ambition in Macbeth or Richard III, he was drawing on a cultural understanding of power that had been fundamentally shaped by Anne's experience. Even more directly, Shakespeare's great tragic heroines, women like Lady Macbeth, Cleopatra, and Cordelia, were created for a society that had learned from Elizabeth's example that women could be just as complex, just as powerful, and just as tragic as men. The psychological depth that Shakespeare gave to his female characters would have been impossible in a culture that hadn't been transformed by the reigns of Anne and Elizabeth. The religious themes in Shakespeare's work also reflect the world that Anne had helped create. His plays are filled with questions about divine authority, legitimate rule, and the relationship between earthly and heavenly power. These weren't abstract philosophical questions for Shakespeare's audience. They were issues that had torn England apart during their lifetimes. Meanwhile, the economic transformation of England during Elizabeth's reign was creating opportunities that would have been unimaginable in Anne Boleyn's time. The wealth that had once been locked up in Catholic monasteries was now circulating through the English economy. Merchants were investing in new technologies, new trade routes, and new industries. Let me tell you the story of Francis Drake, one of the most famous English sea captains of Elizabeth's era. Drake came from a humble background in Devon, the son of a Protestant preacher who had been persecuted during Mary's reign. In Anne Boleyn's time, someone like Drake would never have had the opportunity to rise beyond his birth station. But Elizabeth's England was a different world. Drake's Protestant faith, which would have been dangerous under Mary, was now an asset. His willingness to attack Spanish shipping, which would have been treasonous under a Catholic monarch, was now patriotic service. His success in bringing Spanish treasure back to England made him not just wealthy, but a national hero. Drake's most famous voyage, his circumnavigation of the globe, from 1577 to 1580, was more than just an incredible feat of seamanship. It was a demonstration of English power and Protestant determination that shocked the world. When Drake returned with his ship loaded with Spanish gold, Elizabeth herself came aboard to knight him. The symbolism was perfect. Anne Boleyn's daughter, standing on the deck of an English ship loaded with Catholic treasure, honouring a man whose Protestant faith had driven him to challenge the greatest Catholic empire in the world. It was the complete reversal of everything that had seemed inevitable when Anne was executed 50 years earlier. But the most profound changes were happening in the minds and hearts of ordinary English people. The generation that came of age during Elizabeth's reign had grown up in a world where England was independent, powerful, and Protestant. They had never known papal authority, never experienced foreign domination, never lived under a monarch who seemed weak or uncertain. These people developed a sense of English identity that was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before Anne Boleyn's time. They saw themselves as God's chosen people, as the defenders of true Christianity, as the heirs to a glorious destiny that set them apart from the rest of Europe. This new English identity was being shaped not just by military victories and economic success, but by cultural achievements that amazed the world. English poets were writing verses that rivaled anything produced in Italy or France. English playwrights were creating dramas that drew audiences from across Europe. English scholars were making discoveries that advanced human knowledge in fields from astronomy to medicine. The court that Elizabeth maintained was unlike anything England had ever seen before. Where Henry's court had been magnificent but fundamentally medieval, Elizabeth's was sophisticated in ways that pointed toward the modern world. Courtiers were expected to be not just warriors and landowners, but also poets, scholars, and patrons of the arts. Women played roles in this court that would have been unthinkable in Anne Boleyn's time. They weren't just ornamental figures waiting to be married off. They were active participants in political and cultural life. Some served as Elizabeth's ladies in waiting, positions that carried real influence and responsibility. Others patronized artists and writers, shaping the cultural development of the nation. The most famous of these women was Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke. Mary was a poet, translator, and literary patron who maintained one of the most important intellectual salons in England. Her home became a gathering place for writers, philosophers, and scientists who were transforming English culture. Mary's influence extended far beyond her own literary work. She encouraged and supported dozens of other writers, including her brother Philip Sidney, one of the greatest poets of the Elizabethan age. Her patronage helped create the cultural environment that produced not only Shakespeare, but also Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and Ben Jonson. The fact that a woman could play such a central role in English intellectual life was a direct result of the changes that had begun with Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's successful reign had proven that women could exercise authority effectively, and this had opened up possibilities for other women that simply hadn't existed before. The religious changes that Anne had supported were also bearing fruit in ways that went far beyond politics. The English Bible, which had been available to ordinary people since Henry's time, was creating a more literate and intellectually engaged population. People who could read scripture for themselves were also reading other books, asking questions, and developing independent opinions about all sorts of subjects. This intellectual awakening was contributing to scientific advances that would eventually transform the entire world. Men like William Gilbert, who studied magnetism, and William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood, were working in an environment that encouraged investigation and experimentation rather than blind acceptance of traditional authority. The same questioning spirit that had led Anne to challenge papal authority was now leading English thinkers to challenge traditional assumptions about the natural world. The Protestant emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture had evolved into a broader commitment to individual inquiry and discovery. The economic implications of these changes were staggering. England was becoming not just wealthier, but wealthier in new ways that created opportunities for people from all social classes. The printing industry, which had been essential to spreading Protestant ideas, was now employing hundreds of people and generating substantial profits. The theatre industry, which had grown out of traditional religious drama, but had evolved into something entirely new, was providing entertainment for thousands of people while creating new forms of artistic expression. The exploration and trade industries were bringing wealth into England while spreading English influence around the world. All of these changes can be traced back, directly or indirectly, to the religious and political revolution that had begun with Anne Boleyn's refusal to become Henry's mistress. Her insistence on marriage had led to the break with Rome, which had led to English independence, which had led to Protestant culture, which had led to intellectual freedom, which had led to scientific discovery, which had led to economic expansion, which had led to military power, which had led to global influence. It was a chain of causation that stretched across decades and touched every aspect of English life. The woman who had lost her head for love had, unknowingly, set in motion changes that would reshape not just England, but eventually the entire world. The most incredible part of this story is that none of it was planned. Anne hadn't set out to create a new form of Christianity or establish English dominance over the seas. She had simply wanted to marry the man she loved and secure her own position. But her personal desires had intersected with historical forces in ways that created consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. By the 1590s, when Elizabeth's reign was entering its final phase, England had become something that would have been unrecognizable to the people who had witnessed Anne's execution. It was a confident, prosperous, culturally sophisticated nation that saw itself as divinely chosen for greatness. The generation that had grown up under Elizabeth took this transformation for granted, but older people who remembered the earlier reigns understood how dramatic the change had been. England had gone from being a relatively minor European kingdom, dependent on foreign alliances and papal approval, to being an independent power that other nations had to take seriously. The psychological impact of this transformation was perhaps even more important than the political or economic changes. English people had developed a sense of national pride and cultural confidence that made them believe they could accomplish anything. They saw their recent history not as a series of accidents and coincidences, but as evidence of divine favour and national destiny. This confidence would prove to be one of Anne Boleyn's most important legacies. The English explorers who would establish colonies in North America, the English merchants who would dominate global trade, the English scientists who would lead the scientific revolution, all of them were drawing on a sense of cultural superiority that had its roots in the Elizabethan age. The story of how Anne Boleyn's personal tragedy became England's national triumph is one of the most remarkable examples in history of how individual actions can have consequences that echo across centuries. Her decision to hold out for marriage, rather than accepting the position of royal mistress, had seemed like a personal choice, driven by ambition and romantic feelings. In reality, it was a decision that would reshape the religious, political, cultural, and economic landscape of the entire English-speaking world. The woman who had loved and lost her head had, through that loss, given birth to a new kind of nation and a new way of thinking about human possibilities. But the story doesn't end with Elizabeth's death in 1603. Anne Boleyn's influence would continue to shape English history through the Stuart kings, through the English Civil War, through the development of parliamentary democracy, and eventually through the creation of the British Empire. The religious ideas that had first taken root in England because of Anne's influence would spread to North America with the Puritan colonists. The political concepts that had developed during Elizabeth's reign would influence the American Revolution and the creation of the United States Constitution. The cultural confidence that had emerged during the Elizabethan age would drive English expansion into Africa, Asia, and Australia. The woman who had died on a scaffold in the Tower of London had, unknowingly, helped create the foundation for what would eventually become the most extensive empire in human history. Her personal story of love, ambition, betrayal, and death had become intertwined with forces of historical change that would touch every continent and influence the lives of millions of people she could never have imagined. That's the ultimate paradox of Anne Boleyn's legacy. Her greatest triumph came through her greatest failure. Her most lasting influence emerged from her most devastating defeat, and her most important contribution to history grew out of what seemed at the time to be her complete destruction. The Queen, who had loved and lost her head, had, in losing everything, given the world something precious and enduring. The example of a woman who had been willing to risk everything for her beliefs, her desires, and her vision of what life could be. That example would inspire countless others across the centuries to take their own risks, fight their own battles, and pursue their own dreams of a better world. Anne Boleyn's story might have ended with her execution, but the reverberations of her life were just beginning to reshape the world in ways that would have astounded even her brilliant mind. Because while we've been focused on England and Elizabeth, something extraordinary was happening across the Atlantic Ocean that would carry Anne's legacy to places she never could have imagined. Picture this scene. It's 1607, just 4 years after Elizabeth's death, and a group of English settlers is struggling to survive in a swampy wilderness they've named Jamestown. These men are starving, disease-ridden, and desperately homesick. Many of them are dying, and those who survive are beginning to wonder if they've made a terrible mistake by leaving England. But here's what's incredible about these settlers. They're carrying with them ideas about government, religion, and individual rights that trace directly back to the changes Anne Boleyn had set in motion 70 years earlier. They've brought English Bibles, Protestant ministers, and most importantly, a belief that they don't need permission from foreign authorities to govern themselves. The leader who would save Jamestown was a man named John Smith, and his story reveals just how far Anne's influence had travelled. Smith was a commoner who had risen through merit rather than birth, something that would have been almost impossible in the rigid social structure that existed before Henry's break with Rome. The religious and political changes that followed Anne's marriage had created opportunities for people like Smith to prove themselves based on ability rather than ancestry. Smith's famous encounter with Pocahontas has become part of American mythology, but what's often overlooked is the religious and cultural context that shaped how these English colonists interacted with Native Americans. The Protestantism they brought with them emphasized individual reading of scripture and personal relationship with God, concepts that made them more willing to see Native Americans as potential converts rather than simply as obstacles to be removed. This doesn't mean the colonists were saints. They certainly weren't. But their Protestant worldview, which had emerged from the religious revolution that began with Anne Boleyn, gave them a framework for thinking about Native Americans as fellow human beings who could potentially be brought into Christian civilization. It was a perspective that would have profound implications for how American culture developed. Meanwhile, another group of English settlers was preparing for an even more ambitious journey. These were the Puritans, Protestant reformers, who believed that the English church hadn't gone far enough in breaking away from Catholic traditions. They wanted to create what their leader John Winthrop called a city upon a hill, a perfect Christian society that would serve as an example to the rest of the world. The Puritans who sailed on the Mayflower in 1620 were carrying with them ideas about self-governance that had emerged during the religious upheavals of the previous century. The Mayflower Compact, which they signed before landing at Plymouth Rock, was one of the first documents in American history to establish the principle that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. Think about the chain of causation here. Anne Boleyn's refusal to become Henry's mistress had led to the break with Rome, which had led to Protestant emphasis on individual conscience, which had led to questions about political authority, which had led to the idea that people could govern themselves without kings or bishops telling them what to do. The Puritan experiment in Massachusetts would become one of the most important laboratories for democratic government in human history. These settlers were creating institutions based on the radical idea that ordinary people were capable of making decisions about their own lives and communities. It was a concept that would eventually evolve into the American Revolution and the Constitution. But let me tell you about someone whose personal story shows how Anne Boleyn's legacy was being lived out in the daily experiences of ordinary people. Her name was Anne Hutchinson, and she arrived in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1634 with her husband and children, seeking religious freedom in the New World. Hutchinson was an extraordinary woman who had been deeply influenced by Puritan theology, but she took Protestant ideas about individual interpretation of Scripture further than most church leaders were comfortable with. She began holding meetings in her home where she would discuss the previous Sunday's sermon and offer her own theological insights. These meetings became incredibly popular, especially among women who rarely had opportunities to participate in religious discussions. Hutchinson was a brilliant speaker who could explain complex theological concepts in ways that ordinary people could understand. She encouraged her listeners to think for themselves about religious questions rather than simply accepting what ministers told them. The parallels between Hutchinson and Anne Boleyn are striking. Both were intelligent women who refused to accept the limitations that society placed on them. Both used their understanding of religious questions to challenge male authority. Both found themselves in conflict with established institutions that saw them as threats to proper order. But there was a crucial difference. Hutchinson was living in a society that had been shaped by the religious changes Anne Boleyn had helped initiate. The Protestant emphasis on individual conscience gave Hutchinson a theological foundation for her activities that Anne had never possessed. The colonial setting gave her opportunities for leadership that would have been impossible in England. Hutchinson's story also reveals how Anne's legacy was evolving in unexpected directions. The religious freedom that Protestant colonists claimed for themselves was creating space for even more radical ideas about spiritual authority. Hutchinson argued that individuals could receive direct revelation from God, bypassing not just Catholic priests but Protestant ministers as well. This was too much for the Massachusetts authorities, who put Hutchinson on trial for heresy in 1637. The trial became a sensation throughout the colony, with people travelling from distant settlements to hear this remarkable woman defend her beliefs against the most learned ministers in New England. Hutchinson's performance during her trial was every bit as impressive as Anne Boleyn's had been a century earlier. She demonstrated a mastery of Scripture that amazed even her opponents, and she articulated a vision of religious freedom that was decades ahead of its time. Like Anne, she ultimately lost her legal battle, but like Anne, her ideas would prove more durable than the institutions that condemned her. Hutchinson was banished from Massachusetts and eventually settled in what would become New York, where she continued to preach and teach until her death in 1643. Her followers established communities based on principles of religious tolerance that would influence American thinking about church and state for generations to come. The ideas that Hutchinson represented, ideas that trace back through Protestant theology to the religious revolution that began with Anne Boleyn, were spreading throughout the American colonies in ways that would have seemed impossible in 16th century England. Religious diversity was becoming not just tolerated, but celebrated as colonists from different Protestant traditions learned to live together peacefully. In Pennsylvania, William Penn was creating a colony based on Quaker principles of religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence. In Maryland, Catholics and Protestants were experimenting with religious pluralism. In Rhode Island, Roger Williams was establishing the first colony with complete separation of church and state. All of these experiments in religious freedom drew on theological and political concepts that had emerged from the English Reformation that Anne Boleyn had helped initiate. The idea that government shouldn't control individual conscience, the belief that people could interpret Scripture for themselves, the conviction that religious diversity could strengthen rather than weaken society. All of these concepts had their roots in the upheavals of Henry's reign. But the most profound changes were happening in the realm of economic opportunity. The American colonies were creating a society where social mobility was possible in ways that would have been unimaginable in the rigid class structure of medieval England. People could improve their circumstances through hard work, intelligence, and luck, rather than being trapped forever in the social position of their birth. Consider the story of Benjamin Franklin, who was born in 1606 into a modest Boston family, but would eventually become one of the most influential figures in American history. Franklin's father was a candle maker, a perfectly respectable trade, but hardly one that suggested his son would dine with kings and shape the destiny of nations. Franklin's rise was made possible by the same forces that had been unleashed during Anne Boleyn's time: the spread of literacy through Protestant emphasis on Bible reading, the growth of printing and publishing industries, the development of commercial networks that rewarded innovation and entrepreneurship. The religious and political changes that had begun in Henry's court had created economic opportunities that were transforming how people thought about human possibilities. Franklin's scientific achievements were also part of Anne's legacy, though he certainly never thought about it that way. The Protestant emphasis on individual investigation of truth, rather than blind acceptance of traditional authority, had created an intellectual environment where people like Franklin felt free to challenge conventional wisdom about everything from electricity to political theory. The printing press that made Franklin wealthy was the same technology that had spread Protestant ideas throughout Europe. The postal system that he helped establish in America was based on communication networks that had been essential to coordinating religious reform. The scientific societies that he founded were modeled on institutions that had emerged during the intellectual ferment of the English Reformation. By the 1700s, the American colonies had become something that would have been unrecognizable to Anne Boleyn, but that was nevertheless the product of changes she had helped initiate. These were societies where religious diversity was accepted, where social mobility was possible, where individuals could challenge authority without losing their heads, and where new ideas were welcomed rather than feared. The intellectual confidence that had emerged during Elizabeth's reign was flowering in American universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. These institutions were training ministers, lawyers, doctors, and teachers who carried Enlightenment ideas about reason, liberty, and human rights to communities throughout the colonies. The economic prosperity that had begun during the Elizabethan age was creating American merchant families whose wealth rivaled that of European nobility. Men like John Hancock and Robert Morris were using their fortunes to support political causes that would have been considered treasonous in Anne Boleyn's time. But that seemed natural and inevitable to people who had grown up believing in individual rights and limited government. The political ideas that had been developing since Henry's break with Rome were reaching their logical conclusion in documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The principle that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, which had been implicit in Protestant theology, was becoming explicit in American political theory. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was drawing on intellectual traditions that trace back through John Locke and other English philosophers to the religious and political upheavals of the Tudor period. When Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, he was articulating concepts that had their ultimate origin in Protestant ideas about individual conscience and spiritual equality. The Constitution that emerged from the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 was perhaps the most complete expression of ideas that had been developing since Anne Boleyn's time. The separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the protection of individual rights, all of these concepts reflected lessons that had been learned from centuries of religious and political conflict in England. The men who created the American Republic understood that power corrupts and that even well-intentioned rulers could become tyrannical if their authority wasn't limited by law and custom. They had studied the rise and fall of English monarchs from Henry VIII through the Stuart kings, and they were determined to create a system that would prevent any single person or group from accumulating too much power. The Bill of Rights, which was added to the Constitution in 1791, represented the culmination of struggles for religious and political freedom that had begun with the English Reformation. The First Amendment's protection of religious liberty was a direct descendant of Protestant arguments about individual conscience. The other amendments reflected hard-won lessons about the dangers of unlimited government power. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of how Anne Boleyn's legacy played out in America was the role that women began to play in this new society. While they still faced significant legal and social restrictions, American women had opportunities and influence that would have been impossible in earlier centuries. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, was actively involved in political discussions and used her influence to advocate for women's rights. In her famous letter to her husband during the Continental Congress, she warned him to remember the ladies when creating laws for the new nation. Her ability to participate in political discourse reflected changes in women's roles that had been developing since Elizabeth's reign. Mercy Otis Warren was writing political satire and historical works that influenced public opinion during the Revolutionary period. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved African-American woman, was publishing poetry that challenged assumptions about race and gender. These women were building on foundations that had been laid by earlier generations of women who had pushed against social constraints. The educational opportunities available to American women were also expanding in ways that reflected Protestant emphasis on literacy and learning. Women's academies were being established throughout the colonies, and while they didn't offer the same classical education available to men, they provided training in subjects like history, literature, and moral philosophy that prepared women for more active roles in society. The religious revivals that swept through the American colonies during the 18th century, known as the Great Awakening, created additional opportunities for women to participate in public life. Female preachers like Sarah Osborne and Sarah Edwards were leading religious meetings and influencing thousands of people through their spiritual leadership. These women were following paths that had been opened by earlier religious reformers, including Anne Boleyn herself. The Protestant emphasis on individual relationship with God had created space for women to claim spiritual authority in ways that would have been impossible under Catholic hierarchy. The economic changes that were transforming American society were also creating new roles for women. Colonial women were running taverns, operating printing presses, managing farms, and engaging in trade. While they still faced legal restrictions, they had practical opportunities for independence that reflected the broader social changes that had been developing since the Tudor period. The story of Eliza Lucas Pinckney illustrates how far these changes had progressed by the mid-18th century. Pinckney was a teenage girl who took over management of her father's South Carolina plantations when he was called away on military duty. She experimented with different crops, eventually introducing indigo cultivation to the colony and creating an industry that would generate enormous wealth. Pinckney's success would have been impossible in Anne Boleyn's time, not just because of social restrictions on women, but because the economic and intellectual infrastructure that supported her achievements didn't exist. The scientific knowledge she used, the commercial network she accessed, the legal framework that protected her property rights, all of these were products of changes that had been developing for 2 centuries. The confidence and ambition that Pinckney demonstrated were also part of Anne's legacy. The belief that individuals could shape their own destinies, that traditional limitations could be overcome through intelligence and determination, that new opportunities were constantly emerging for those bold enough to seize them. These attitudes had been developing since the English Reformation had challenged traditional authority structures. By the time of the American Revolution, the descendants of English colonists had created societies that embodied principles Anne Boleyn had died defending: the right to challenge authority, the importance of individual conscience, the possibility of social advancement, and the belief that people could govern themselves without interference from foreign powers. The revolution itself was fought using arguments that traced back to Protestant political theory. When American colonists declared that they would not be taxed without representation, they were asserting principles about consent and governance that had been developing since Parliament had supported Henry's break with Rome. When they established state governments based on written constitutions, they were applying lessons learned from centuries of English constitutional development. The success of the American Revolution sent shockwaves throughout Europe that were every bit as dramatic as those that had followed Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry. Here was proof that Enlightenment ideas about government and liberty weren't just theoretical concepts, they could actually work in practice. The French Revolution, that began in 1789, was directly inspired by the American example, and French revolutionaries explicitly drew on ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty that had been developing in the English-speaking world since the Reformation. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was modelled on American documents that were themselves products of Protestant political thought. The democratic revolutions that swept across Europe during the 19th century all drew inspiration from the American model, carrying ideas that originated in Tudor England to countries that had never experienced Protestant Reformation. The principle of religious liberty, the concept of written constitutions, the belief in individual rights, all of these ideas spread from their English origins to become universal principles of modern democratic government. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was transforming economic life in ways that built on foundations laid during the commercial expansion of Elizabeth's reign. The scientific method that had emerged from Protestant emphasis on individual investigation was generating technological innovations that revolutionized manufacturing, transportation, and communication. The same intellectual confidence that had characterized Elizabethan England was now driving English inventors, entrepreneurs, and engineers to create machines and systems that would reshape the entire world. Steam engines, textile factories, railways, and telegraph lines were all products of an approach to innovation that had its roots in the cultural transformation that began with Anne Boleyn's influence on Henry. The British Empire that emerged during the 18th and 19th centuries was the ultimate expression of the national confidence that had been building since Elizabeth's reign. English explorers, merchants, and administrators carried with them not just economic and military power, but also ideas about government, law, and individual rights that would influence societies around the globe. The legal systems established in British colonies from India to Australia to Canada were based on English common law traditions that had been shaped by centuries of constitutional development since Henry's time. The educational institutions that the British established in their colonies promoted literacy and learning in ways that reflected Protestant values about the importance of individual education. Even the languages that emerged in former British colonies carried traces of ideas that had originated during the English Reformation. The emphasis on clear communication, logical argument, and empirical evidence that characterized English intellectual life had become embedded in the very structure of English as it was spoken and written around the world. The abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833 was another expression of ideas that trace back to Protestant emphasis on individual dignity and spiritual equality. While it took far too long for these principles to be applied to enslaved people, the intellectual foundation for abolition had been developing since Protestant theologians had begun arguing about the nature of human conscience and individual rights. The women's rights movements that emerged during the 19th century in England, America, and other English-speaking countries drew explicitly on arguments about equality and individual conscience that had Protestant origins. When women like Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued for female suffrage and legal equality, they were extending principles that had been implicit in Protestant theology since Anne Boleyn's time. The scientific advances that characterized the 19th century, from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to Michael Faraday's discoveries about electricity, were products of an intellectual environment that valued empirical investigation over traditional authority. This approach to knowledge had its origins in the Protestant emphasis on individual interpretation of truth rather than blind acceptance of institutional teachings. By the end of the 19th century, the ideas that had emerged from the religious and political upheavals that began with Anne Boleyn had spread throughout the world and were transforming societies on every continent. Democratic governments, market economies, scientific institutions, educational systems, and legal frameworks based on individual rights were becoming the dominant forms of human organization. The woman who had lost her head for refusing to accept the limitations that society placed on her had, through the chain of consequences that followed her death, helped create a world where such limitations were increasingly seen as illegitimate and unsustainable. Her personal tragedy had become humanity's triumph. Her individual defeat had become the foundation for centuries of progress toward greater freedom and opportunity. The 21st century world that we inhabit today bears the unmistakable imprint of changes that began in the court of Henry VIII, when a young woman named Anne Boleyn decided that she would not settle for being a king's mistress. The religious freedom we take for granted, the democratic governments we participate in, the economic opportunities we pursue, the educational systems we benefit from, the scientific knowledge we rely on, all of these are part of her legacy. Anne Boleyn loved and lost her head, but in losing everything, she gained immortality. Her story became part of the larger human story of progress toward greater freedom, dignity, and opportunity. The queen who reigned for less than 3 years influenced the development of human civilization for centuries to come. That's the ultimate meaning of Anne Boleyn's extraordinary life. She proved that individuals can change the world, that personal choices can have historical consequences, and that even the most devastating defeats can, over time, become the foundation for unprecedented victories. Her legacy lives on not just in history books, but in the daily experiences of billions of people who enjoy freedoms and opportunities that exist because one remarkable woman refused to accept the world as she found it and dared to imagine something better. The ripple effects of Anne Boleyn's story were about to take another dramatic turn that would reshape the English-speaking world in ways that even her brilliant daughter Elizabeth could never have anticipated. Because while we've been tracing her influence through religious reform and colonial expansion, something extraordinary was happening in the realm of ideas that would carry Anne's legacy into the modern age. Picture this scene. It's 1649, and a King of England is standing on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in London. But this isn't just any king. This is Charles I, and he's about to become the first English monarch ever to be executed by his own subjects. The crowd watching this unprecedented event includes people whose grandparents had witnessed Anne Boleyn's execution over a century earlier. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Once again, an English ruler was losing their head because of conflicts that traced back to the religious and political changes Anne had helped set in motion. Charles had tried to impose his will on Parliament and restore Catholic practices to the English Church. His subjects had decided that kings, like queens, could be held accountable for their actions. The man who signed Charles' death warrant was Oliver Cromwell, and his story reveals just how completely Anne's legacy had transformed English society. Cromwell came from a family of minor gentry who had risen to prominence during the dissolution of the monasteries. The wealth that had once belonged to Catholic institutions had been redistributed to Protestant families like his, creating a new class of landowners who had no loyalty to traditional royal authority. Cromwell's religious beliefs were shaped by the same Protestant theology that Anne had supported, but taken to its logical extreme. He believed that God spoke directly to individual believers, that earthly authorities had no right to interfere with conscience, and that society should be organized according to biblical principles rather than royal whims. When Parliament went to war against Charles in 1642, Cromwell raised a regiment of cavalry that became famous throughout England for its discipline and effectiveness. These weren't professional soldiers fighting for pay. They were ordinary farmers and craftsmen fighting for principles they believed were worth dying for. Cromwell's soldiers sang Protestant hymns as they rode into battle. They carried Bibles in their saddlebags alongside their weapons. They saw themselves as God's instruments, chosen to purify England from the corruptions that had crept back into church and state. The religious passion that had driven Anne Boleyn to challenge papal authority had evolved into something that could topple kings. The English Civil War was fought using arguments that would have been impossible before the Reformation that Anne had helped initiate. Parliament claimed the right to limit royal power based on principles that traced back to Protestant ideas about individual conscience and divine authority. The common people who supported Parliament believed they were defending freedoms that had been established when England broke free from Roman control. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. The ideas that triumphed in the English Civil War were simultaneously spreading to other parts of the world where they would have even more dramatic consequences. While Cromwell was establishing his republican government in England, colonists in New England were creating institutions, religious freedom, and popular based on the same principles of government. Let me tell you about John Winthrop, the Puritan leader who had established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Winthrop had grown up during the reign of James I, when the religious settlement that Elizabeth had created was under constant pressure from both Catholic sympathizers and radical Protestants who wanted further reform. Winthrop's decision to leave England and establish a city upon a hill in America was directly motivated by his belief that the English Church hadn't completed the Reformation that Anne Boleyn had begun. He wanted to create a society where Protestant principles could be implemented without interference from bishops or kings who still retained Catholic sympathies. The government that Winthrop established in Massachusetts was revolutionary in ways that wouldn't become apparent for decades. While it was officially a theocracy, with church membership required for voting, it was also fundamentally democratic. Important decisions were made by assemblies where ordinary colonists could speak their minds and influence policy. This combination of religious authority and popular participation created something entirely new in human history, a society where divine law was interpreted not by priests or kings, but by the collective wisdom of believing communities. It was exactly the kind of system that Protestant theologians had been imagining since the early days of the Reformation. The intellectual atmosphere in Winthrop's Massachusetts was unlike anything that had existed in medieval Europe. The emphasis on literacy, biblical study, and rational discourse created communities where ideas were constantly being debated and refined. Harvard College, which was established in 1636, became a center for theological and philosophical investigation that attracted students from throughout the English-speaking world. Meanwhile, something equally remarkable was happening in the economic realm. The same Protestant work ethic that had driven Elizabeth's courtiers to excel in multiple fields was now inspiring American colonists to unprecedented levels of productivity and innovation. The belief that worldly success could be a sign of divine favor was transforming how people thought about labor, investment, and economic development. Consider the story of John Hull, a silversmith who arrived in Boston in 1635 as a young apprentice. Hull's family had been driven from England by religious persecution during the reign of Charles I, and they arrived in America with little more than their Protestant faith and their commitment to hard work. Hull's rise to prosperity illustrates how the religious and social changes that began with Anne Boleyn were creating new forms of economic opportunity. In England, craftsmen like Hull would have been trapped in guild systems that limited competition and innovation. In America, he was free to develop his skills, expand his business, and accumulate wealth in ways that would have been impossible under traditional economic structures. Hull eventually became the mint master for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, responsible for creating the first coins minted in English North America. The pine tree shillings he produced were symbols of American economic independence that foreshadowed the political century later. But Hull's most important contribution wasn't economic, it was educational. He used his wealth to support Harvard College and other institutions that were training ministers and teachers for the growing colonial population. The same Protestant emphasis on learning that had characterized Elizabeth's court was now creating educational opportunities for ordinary people throughout New England. The books that Hull and other colonial merchants imported from England were spreading Enlightenment ideas about reason, science, and government to communities that were eager for intellectual stimulation. Works by John Locke, Isaac Newton, and other English thinkers were being read and discussed in colonial homes, churches, and taverns. These ideas were falling on fertile ground because the religious and political culture of colonial America had been shaped by the same Protestant principles that had produced the English Civil War. The belief that individuals could interpret truth for themselves, that authority should be limited by law and custom, that government should serve the people rather than the reverse. All of these concepts were becoming part of the common sense of colonial society. The Great Awakening that swept through the American colonies during the 1730s and 1740s was another expression of the religious energy that Anne Boleyn had helped unleash. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were drawing enormous crowds with messages that emphasized individual conversion, personal relationship with God, and the possibility of spiritual renewal. Edwards, in particular, was developing theological ideas that built on foundations laid during the English Reformation. His famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, used vivid imagery and logical argument to convince listeners that they needed to take personal responsibility for their spiritual condition. It was exactly the kind of individualistic